Thank you very much indeed, Petri, and thank you everyone for the rousing reception. Welcome indeed to the great room at the Royal Society of the Arts. Extremely august surroundings and a delightful change to see splendid murals on the wall as opposed to the padded cell in which LBC presenters ordinarily do their stuff. We are here to consider important matters, possibly one of the most important questions that faces society today, and it is by happy chance that we address the question of a walk-on-by culture, if you like, upon the very day that David Cameron chose to put at least some flesh upon the currently rather bare bones of his big society notion, the empowerment of the citizenry, the idea of community cohesion somehow fostering social progress, and of course the sense that we could all do more to improve the environment in which we live. That at least is the official version of Big Society. The unofficial version, although we still haven't considered all of the details, appears to be that you'll take away people's jobs and replace them with volunteers to do exactly the same thing without the inconvenience of having to pay them. But when it comes to civilian involvement in antisocial behaviour, there is, of course, a big problem facing this country at the moment, and it's a problem quite brilliantly distilled in the Royal Society of Arts publication last week of Ben Rogers' work, Can Citizens Tackle Antisocial Behaviour? The distillation of that we're approaching this evening is best expressed in the phrase, or the question, stand by or take a stand. I'm delighted, therefore, to say that Ben Rogers is on the panel this evening. He is an Associate Fellow of the Institute for Public Policy Research and the think tank Demos, has worked as a policy strategist for the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit and the Department for Communities and Local Government. Achieved an astonishing amount of press coverage for the report last week, entitled The Willich Model, not least, of course, an hour of astonishingly erudite discussion on my programme on LBC 97.3. Also here this evening, Nick Ross, a journalist and broadcaster whose career is frankly so stellar and so, dare I say, lengthy that I'm not going to read it out in any detail because it will bring upon a fit of insecurity and inadequacy on my part. He is, I think it's fair to say, best known for the 23 years that he spent presenting the Crime Watch programme on the BBC, on BBC One, and which I think puts Nick in the position of being one of the early architects of encouraging citizen participation in crime solution. It seems odd, really, to reflect upon the world before Crime Watch, where, with the possible exception of Shaw Taylor, which I can see many of you in the audience are easily old enough to remember, it was not something that we had ever really taken upon ourselves before. Ken Livingstone arguably needs no introduction, former Mayor of London, broadcaster now on LBC 97.3 and a politician of great renown, already declared as a candidate for the mayoral race, already seeking Labour's nomination for the mayoral race in 2012, and promising to put London first and use his experience of office to get the most from what will be a difficult economic and political time for Britain and for London. Also with us this evening is Matthew Taylor, who of course is the Chief Executive of the RSA, and as such our host this evening. Prior to this appointment, he was Chief Advisor on Political Strategy to the Prime Minister, and of course also will have been responsible for commissioning Ben to write this report in the first place. Finally, but by no means least, Marilyn Hebron is the Street Watch head coordinator, and as such at the very vanguard of attempts to encourage and empower. I sense that this word empower is going to be heard a lot tonight. I'll try and come up with some synonyms in the course of proceedings, I promise. But at the vanguard of attempts to encourage local residents to articulate their care for their community in a more meaningful fashion. Again, tying in with some of the comments we heard David Cameron make earlier today, by being willing to spend a few hours a month walking about open spaces, providing a visible presence, offering support, reassurance, and such like. When we've heard from the panel, I'd be delighted if anybody here this evening would like to respond to what they've heard, contribute in any other meaningful way, or indeed open up a line of discussion that you feel has been ignored by the people sitting in front of you this evening. So we'll begin, I think, by asking Ben Rogers, the author of the Woolwich model, a reference, incidentally, to the way in which first aid courses swept the world after being introduced on an initially rather small scale in Woolwich at the back end of the 19th century. Can citizens tackle antisocial behaviour? And, of course, the attendant question there will be, how on earth can we go about at least starting the process? Ben, is that an agreeably broad introduction for you?
It is. I mean, my proposal is actually pretty modest. It's simply that we should at least try to train people, ordinary people. It could be public service workers, park wardens, postal workers, people working in public transport, but also citizens. We should just train them in the way we train people to do first aid. We should train them in community safety skills. So when they're confronted with antisocial behaviour, they know three sets of things, really. They know how to read a situation and work out whether it's so minor they can walk on by, or whether it's so dangerous they have to call the police, whether it's in between and they can safely or relatively safely make an intervention. They know how to position themselves to maximize their safety, to get out, to protect themselves if they were attacked. And they know how to diffuse a situation, to de-escalate it, to talk someone down when they're het up, to mediate between people. And that training actually is already being provided below the radar, and I'm saying we need more of it, and it will complement the sort of formal policing that goes on in our communities.
And it would be confined, would it, in the first instance, to people who are already in positions of authority, I suppose is the word I have to use?
I don't think necessarily. I think actually a lot of antisocial behaviour is associated with young people, is committed by young people. And I think actually most grown-ups, in a sense, are in a position of authority in that degree.
So it is not merely for park keepers?
No, it could be. I think any citizen, anyone who would find it useful should be able to access that training.
Nick Ross, I'll come to you next, if I may, because you have, as I mentioned in the introduction, a very knowledgeable position on this, and in many ways a unique perspective. So I'd be interested to know what you understand the phrase community safety skills to mean, and whether you think you've got any.
I don't think I have got any. I'm trustee of a charity called Diffuse, which is a brand new charity, which is trying to do much of the things that Ben has just been describing, but for ordinary people. Police are trained how to diffuse situations, and it's quite a useful skill, and we think it would be helpful if more of us had that skill. But I would say we mustn't talk ourselves into a crisis that doesn't really exist here. Don't panic, Captain Mannering. We are not as bad as we might think we are. If you trawl through, as an academic from Lancaster University has, thousands of hours of CCTV from town centres and look at examples of where things go wrong, and we hear that people don't intervene, what you find is actually, on the whole, most people do. And the paradox is that the more passers-by there are, the less likely we are to intervene. So although we might say we're frightened, actually we're more likely to do something when we're on our own or with just a friend or three other people than when there's a big crowd of us. It's absolutely paradoxical, absolutely fascinating. But my point is, I think we're starting from a much better starting point, and we mustn't talk ourselves into a feeling, oh, we're all so scared we daren't do anything.
No, and there was also, I think, also from Lancaster University, some research last week that found that the likelihood of a young person being engaged in violent crime was just under 1 in 100 people, but the public perception was that the figure would be closer to 30%. So you're absolutely right that pessimism is perhaps not the healthiest of starting points, but Ben's findings were specific to the UK and, for example, found that Germans would be on average twice as likely to stop a bunch of 14-year-olds conducting an impromptu dismantlement of a bus shelter compared to Britons.
Well, just be careful. That came from the Jill Dandom Institute of Crime Science, which I helped found, and I'm a visiting professor there. And we mustn't cherry pick too much. It is true, that example. That statistic is correct, and I think the sample is probably big enough for that to be realistic. But if you look more broadly, we're not that bad, you know. For example, if you ask yourself, would you intervene if you saw a child being abducted in the street? I think most people would. It's circumstance, circumstance, circumstance. It's not that we're a bunch of cowards. It's not that we are absolutely mortified of what might happen to us in terms of the police having a go at us or being stabbed. Often, and there's a lot of scientific evidence to demonstrate this, often we're frightened of being embarrassed in front of others.
Which might actually be the uniquely English element of that finding. I think it is a curious condition in this country. Let's have a show of hands in that case. Obviously, it would be both flippant and foolish to ask who has helped prevent the abduction of a child. But of the 200 or 300 people in this room this evening, how many feel that they have effectively intervened, not necessarily to stop a crime, but to curtail antisocial behaviour? Crikey. Well, I think we can end the debate right here. It seems the country's in incredibly safe hands. Just for everybody listening at home, that was approximately half of the audience and at least one member of the panel. I only saw Nick Ross raise his hand. I didn't see anybody to my right. And, of course, Marilyn Hebron, who we'd have a problem if you hadn't, as the Street Watch head coordinator, an organisation absolutely dedicated to helping local residents keep their own local towns or villages safe. Marilyn, we're short of time, so I'll give you the opportunity to provide us with a headline and then come back to you after the travel news. How feasible is it for an ordinary person who is sort of vaguely aware of the need for action and vaguely aware that they could perhaps play a role in that action themselves to actually become a useful diffuser of dangerous situations? In a way, people that want to help possibly already are.
One of the biggest barriers I found when you're working on your own, A, is if you are isolated, your own emotions are very high and you're likely to be confrontational. B, the other side is you think you're making a fool of yourself, that the police might not support you in it, that you're being stupid. Now, all those are very, very big barriers. But by joining a group of people who support each other and pass on each other's skills on how to deal with situations, it lowers the emotional temperature. And the communication is far more effective.
The British Crime Survey last week found that incidents of antisocial behaviour had actually dropped for the first time in, I think, over a decade. So there is definitely a problem of perception as opposed to reality, Marilyn. But is it fair to say that the police aren't always as encouraging as they could be of the sort of work that organisations like yours undertake?
No, it's an interesting one because part of Street Watch, I mean, it has been initiated by the police, but it involves both a change on perception on the part of the public, but also a change in perception of how the police operate. It becomes a partnership. Street Watch is independent, but that closer relationship with the police means that a dialogue is created. Skills are passed on to the volunteers so they become more proficient observers. So police actually have useful information rather than being inundated by things.
But if I were to set off in hot pursuit of someone who had, I don't know, lobbed a hamburger through my window or something like that, then the police would probably advise me that I should have stayed put and phoned them.
Yes.
So there is a slight tension
between... And we as Street Watch volunteers would do exactly the same. You know when to address a situation and when to stand back.
Which is back to Ben's initial point about the assessment coming before the positioning or the diffusement. I'm sure we'll hear more from you in a moment, Marilyn, but Ken Livingstone, never short of an opinion on just about any subject under the sun, Ken, but of course, as a former mayor of London, you have presided over a period in which the public have certainly felt more exposed to antisocial behaviour. Whether they're right to do so or not is moot. But how optimistic are you about the notion that the solution lies within the community rather than within the forces of law and order?
I think it does very much. I grew up in this city in the 50s, and I knew as a kid if I did anything wrong, almost everybody around would say you shouldn't be doing that. And whether it was a little old lady or a city gent. And I think part of our problem is, although effectively compared with other cities, London is a remarkably safe one, there's this line in the media that if it bleeds, it leads. If all you do is rely on the popular media, you can have the impression crime is much worse than it is. I was on a bus on Cricklewood last week. A guy got in the middle, didn't pay. And I think no one actually thinks these things are in advance. And I just said, you haven't paid. And...
It must have frightened the life out of him.
And this was about 11 o'clock in the morning, and he was clearly had some exotic substance and wasn't going to get off. And then gradually everybody else on the bus started to say, you must get off, you know. And the poor old driver didn't want to get out of his cab and so on. And I just think if the media was encouraging us all to intervene, we would do much more of it. The problem is there are areas, particularly if you're a teenager and where you've got an established gang, this is deadly. But for the majority of us, in the majority of London, intervening will make people back down and stop putting their feet on the... It's small things. It isn't just, you know, when someone produces a knife, it's a small thing. When someone's got their feet on the seat on the bus, you should say so. I always do. They hate me for it. You know?
Yes, I wonder, I don't know how, you clearly are, unlike many politicians, in touch with the man on the street, as it were. You're not ferried from appointment to appointment by limousine, but you are also instantly recognisable.
And no one's going to do what I say because of my great physique, are they?
No.
This guy stopped there. There's this guy got on the tube, held the door open, delayed the tube, and I just said, oh, you shouldn't do that. And I realised he's a head taller than I am, 20 years younger and built like a tank. And I thought, I must be mad. But if we all did it, they would stop.
I have to, and regular listeners to my programme will expect me to say at this point, that I had precisely the opposite experience myself, just within the last 2 months, when somebody was playing their infernal music on the London Underground out of a mobile phone, and I put on my best polite face and asked them to stop, and it unleashed a tirade of truly vitriolic abuse, directed not at me initially, but at every single person on the carriage. And then when one other person who was an employee of London Underground did seek to intervene, he came in for such a volley of horrible language that, frankly, I began to wonder whether I should have said anything in the first place at all. I mention that simply by way of balance and not
Did
in an
anybody
attempt
else?
to prove
Was
that
it just you and the Underground
LBC
employee?
presenters have launched some sort of vigilante group across. No, well, one or two other people did, but
We
one
should
was...
get Nick Ferrari on that.
Well,
He
yes.
can intimidate.
Sit on them, I suppose. Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive of the Royal Society of the Arts, but perhaps more pertinently this evening, a former Chief Advisor on political strategy to the Prime Minister. There is a flavour, or at least a suspicion at the moment, among all talk of big society and citizen empowerment, that politicians have failed utterly to protect us, so now they're asking us to protect ourselves.
Well, I think the fascinating first point to make is that you've got a panel of people here from different backgrounds, and we're having an intelligent conversation about crime and antisocial behaviour, and that, I think, is an important step forward, because for a very long time we haven't been having intelligent conversations about these issues. They've been polarised, they've been alarmist, and I agree with everything that's been said. Actually, the situation is improving. London, relatively speaking, is a safe city. Part of the problem is to do with fear. One of my favourite statistics is that crime levels are about the same in Denmark as they are in Britain, but we're 3 times more worried than the Danes are about crime. So, perceptions play into this as well, and Ken's made the point about the media. A couple of the things that I'd want to throw in. Of course, there is this question about the big society and whether or not it's being used as a cover for public service cuts. But whoever was in power now, they've been making very difficult decisions. And in fact, it's not just Conservative coalition government, but I was reading a report by the Labour Lambeth Council the other day saying, in the future there'll be things public services can't do, and we're going to need citizens to step up to the plate. So, there will be less police, fewer police, there'll be fewer wardens. We are going to have to pick up some of this work ourselves. So we are going to actually have to step forward, even if things aren't as bad as people sometimes portray they are. So even things are okay now, we probably have to do slightly more in the future. And then 2 other final points. First is, I do think in relation to crime and antisocial behaviour, it's important to recognise that the people who suffer most are often the most vulnerable in society. So, recently we had, I think it was a BBC documentary about a Muslim family moving into an estate in Bristol and getting the most terrible levels of kind of harassment and nobody feeling they could intervene because, in a sense, the social norms went against intervention. And there was the family somewhere in the north, I can't remember where it was, with a disabled son who were, basically hounded to their deaths by this continuous kind of behaviour. So I think the most vulnerable people we're looking out for, and that takes me to my final point, which is that although I agree that we should be positive and we should feel able to intervene, there's still a lot of free riding. I look at this audience, and probably the reason so many of you put your hands up is you are the kinds of people who do get involved. But we all want to live in nice places, but a nice place is created by people who do engage. And a lot of people free ride on that. They want to live in a nice place, but they don't want to do anything about it themselves. And that's something that we have to tackle. I live in a part of the Oval, and this is a tiny story, but in our street there's a little green area of land, not about the same kind of floor space as this room, And it's never been used for anything because it's basically a dog's toilet. And no one's ever done anything about it. And year after year after year after year. And then just eventually this summer, maybe because it's so hot, a group of 3 or 4 boys started playing football on it. And just the other day, for more or less the first time, I saw someone challenge someone who was letting their dog have a crap on the grass. You know? And the point is that this area had been left as a place that people would like to have played, but they'd given up on it for years and years, and then just a few kids start to play on it, and suddenly the social norms change. And I bet London's full of these little places, these little ways of doing things, that a tiny intervention could make a huge difference.
You paint a picture of a very modern London, and one which many of us will consider to be a fairly recent phenomenon. Ben Rogers, in your report, what reasons did you come up with that help to explain this apparent transformation of communities from areas where everybody knew each other, or as Ken said, everybody would club in to tell him off when he was a young person? Some things never change, Ken. And now, by contrast, we do all just sit by and watch.
Well, I certainly didn't find any, very convincing or well-researched explanation. So I hazarded a few guesses. I suggested that it probably is the case there's more sort of churn in our communities than was once the case. I wondered whether there were just less people out on the street.
You mean transient populations, people coming and going?
Yeah. I wonder whether there's just less people, public service workers out on the street. You used to have just a parkie who stayed at one park, and now they probably move around. They're off in the private sector. I mean, I think there's a whole range of factors coming together. I mean, I think one of the benefits, actually, of introducing some sort of training is it would also, I think, change people's attitudes, because I think we're often too ready to see antisocial behaviour when it doesn't exist, So we've all seen those signs on estates, no balls here. I mean, kids playing football, and we see it as something which has got to be banned.
It's as if we can't remember being young ourselves, because it's unlikely that we were all fine, upstanding citizens. Nick Ross, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think it's pretty obvious why things have changed. 2 very fundamental ones. One is deference. Back in the 40s and 50s, we had a very class-based system. We all knew our place. We called people sir and ma'am and all the rest of it. That has transformed. We have lost that sense of deference, largely for good, but there are some ill effects of that as well. The other is the transformation about our communities. We have ceased to have geographically located communities, and increasingly we have virtual communities. We have friends we talk to on the phone, on the internet, and all the rest of it. So it's no longer our friends are just in the street. We know our communities by who lives next door. We know probably as many people as we did before, perhaps even more, but they aren't so geographically located close to us. So we've got these big differences in our society. And we do need, although I think all of us on the panel are saying we all need to pitch in ourselves, we do need help from the authorities. We absolutely do. Last year, we did some intensive filming in Oxford, looking at problems there, very, very intensely. We swamped the place with camera crews, with researchers, to find out what was happening. We found a huge amount of the worst things weren't reported to the police. They don't get into the police statistics. And this is why the British Crime Survey is so important for measuring trends. And the police statistics can really be misleading. But we also found that some of the worst social problems were, as we've just been hearing, among the poorest sectors of society. And nobody took a problem-solving approach from the authorities' point of view. The police were looking for an arrest. They could only see that it was very one-dimensional often. Where could we get an arrest? Where could we take someone to court? Rather than, how do we solve this problem long-term? So you might have a police officer turning up at the same address 15, 20 times. The housing association, often, if they had acted right at the beginning and said, this person is antisocial, this person is causing a problem in our community, really acted strongly, in concert with the council, in concert with JPs, not just being on the bench handing out sentencing, but trying to problem solve in the community. People who in the community did stand out sometimes prevailed on their own, but often found that the authorities were very, very slow to help them in a purposeful way.
Some of the contributions coming into the studio there reflect this slightly inaccurate reading of what British society is like these days, the notion that the police would be more interested in feeling your collar if you were to seek to prevent the commission of a crime in front of you, but the rather more credible fear that you may end up on the receiving end of some pretty horrific violence if you seek to prevent somebody else from being the victim of it. Time now to invite contributions from extremely healthy audience here at the Royal Society of the Arts. We'll begin with the gentleman in the front row. Good evening.
Hi, good evening, Dave Straker. diffusing would seem to be a very useful playground skill. I was wondering at what age should you start teaching children these skills and perhaps the duties as well?
Marilyn Hebron first, please.
Well, so I'm taking from the street watch angle, which is trying to create greater cohesiveness in communities. And we're trying to provide a model as to how we behave and how we address situations. And sometimes this will involve young children. I'm sorry I can't address your actually school system. How old? I suppose Street Watch operates on the idea that these ideas diffuse, you catch them from other people, and we've certainly found that to be the case. Just by the fact we have Street Watch volunteers, other members of the community have started catching some of the same behaviour. And I suppose we would hope that that would filter through it all. Does that answer?
Not quite. Could you conceive of a situation in which some of the Street Watch philosophy may be imported explicitly into the classroom? So that rather than having to change the behaviour of adults, you create a generation of people who are already on side, as it were. I think that's what you...
As to actually, what is it? It's caring for each other and caring for the community. Yes. Street Watch members actually do go into schools and talk to the young children. So they know that there's an adult who can talk to them if they've got problems. Can I just go back to that? We're providing a model.
Yes, of course. And that is applicable to people of any age.
Yes,
and even,
yes.
That makes
into young
sense.
Children as well.
Matthew Taylor.
Well, just to say, I think a lot of schools do fantastic work in this area. The RSA has an academy in the West Midlands, and there was a bullying problem until it was the Pupils' Parliament that took responsibility for bullying, and so children went to other children in the Pupils' Parliament to talk to them about bullying, and bullying has now more or less completely been eradicated. So actually, because schools are quite fixed communities, so they don't suffer from the kind of problems of churn, people know each other, actually they're a very good place for people to learn these kinds of skills. And I think lots of schools have involved pupils much more in setting the rules, implementing the rules, tackling issues like bullying. So, and that works pretty well.
Nick Ross, I mentioned in the news there that I hadn't previously been aware of just how much work you do in this field outside of your broadcasting work, and you quite rightly pointed out you've got no idea what I do when I'm not at work either. So how do you feel the idea of catching potential problems young, or indeed catching potential problem solvers young, could translate into social policy?
I think it's absolutely powerful and very, very important. A lot of social psychology has been done on this right back to the 1950s and 60s. And we know that there is such a thing as society. It is hardwired into us. And a lot of children are natural arbiters, a lot of them are natural peacekeepers, but they can do with help. We all can. And I think you're absolutely right. When Jane Atkinson started this charity Diffuse I mentioned at the beginning, the idea was that we should look at for adults doing this. But there's no question, if we can teach these skills to children, how do you diffuse situations before they get ugly? Obviously it's a good idea.
Your research, Ben Rogers, focused on adults intervening with teenagers misbehaving, not on the question of teenagers effectively policing themselves.
No, but I was very interested to discover that if you ask different age groups how concerned they are about antisocial behaviour, it's the youngest age group, young adults, 16 upwards, who are most concerned about it. So it's actually not the older people. That really surprised me. Actually, if you think about it, it's not that surprising, because they're the ones that spend most of the time out in public places.
Well, they suffer twofold, don't they? Because not only are they more likely to be on the receiving end of it, they then suffer from being tarred with the same brush as the people that are misbehaving. The notion of crossing the street to avoid a group of so-called hoodies these days is no longer confined to tabloid scaremongering, is it?
No,
it's something that most people in this room would probably recognise.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think my only reservation about teaching it to children is, yes, but we should also be teaching it to adults. And actually, a bit like first aid, it's something that you should probably return to and have extra training throughout your life.
I suppose the first obstacle to get over is we can all accept and understand how to learn first aid, but these rather more abstract notions. Of course, Marilyn.
On that, I believe Nick is right, in fact, that we have got a natural ability to do this, but what you need is somebody to attend to that and respect you for it and not dismiss it. You have to, the adult has to sort of empower the child to know, yeah, that's correct thinking. That's the way to go. Congratulate them. and whatever concerns that they bring to you, take action.
So
Don't discount them.
So whatever you may learn at school, if
Yeah.
you're not going home to an environment of encouragement and endorsement, it would be a waste of time and energy. Thank you very much. Next question, please, from the gentleman with the beard.
Yes, good evening. The panel's comments are very interesting indeed, and I value them. But it does seem to me that they're treating the subject in rather a narrow, passive manner. And in an effort to broaden it slightly, I'd like to quote you what a Christian pastor, Niemoller, said in World War II. He said, "First they came for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me. By that time, there was no one left to speak up for me."
It's a very powerful quote. Yes. If you could just clarify briefly who you think is coming for who at the moment.
I wouldn't dream of doing that, but what I will say is that we live in a multiracial, multi-ethnic society. We're endeavoring very hard to make it homogenous in this country and succeeding to a great extent. And that certainly would be the desire of, I think, all the people in this room. But there is huge tension in this country and in other parts of Europe and around the world. And that's the broader subject which I hoped we might talk about today. And I certainly am not the person to start that discussion. You are.
Well, Nick Ross is.
The thing about that quote is when you look at diaries kept by people in Nazi Germany from the 1920s, and you see how exactly the same thing happened, it's very easy for us as victors of the Second World War to think that the Germans were somehow uniquely nasty. But when you see how Hitler took over, it was this bit by bit by bit. If you wanted to be, you were a junior lawyer, you had to sign this document if you were to stay a lawyer. And then you found there was another document, and then another document, and you were getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the apparatus until you had sold your soul. I think we're in something very different here from what we were so concerned about in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, where we thought of civil rights, human rights, in terms of authority, in terms of the Stalins, the Hitlers, the dictators. What this debate is very much about is our neighbours. It's not protecting ourselves so much from the government. I'm not saying that isn't sometimes a threat and couldn't be a threat, but the issue here, I think, is very, very, very different.
There's no ideology that could be loosely defined as a shared enemy at the moment. I think what was so powerful about that quote, which is relevant on so many levels of modern politics, is that it focuses upon a distinct foe. Ben Rogers, part of the problem with antisocial behaviour is that we're not quite sure who the enemy is.
No, I think that's a good point, but I think there is evidence that we are more likely to intervene. I think I heard you on the radio talking about this recently, Nick. We are more likely to intervene to look after someone, to do first aid or prevent them being beaten up if we share an identity with them. And that is clear. That actual social scientists do these, or psychologists do these very clever experiments where they sort of fake somebody collapsing with a heart attack, and they look at who goes in to intervene. And it is people who in some dimension see themselves as having an identity.
But that's where that question has got it absolutely right. Because what he did, this is a chap called Mark Levine, what he did is he put people into a virtual environment. It wasn't real, but I promise you, I've been in it myself. It's staggeringly real. Your heart rate goes up. You've got an Arsenal football fan there, and he's being attacked or threatened by someone in a Tottenham, say. It doesn't matter what their shirt is. And are you going to intervene? And what the experiment does is it puts people who are Arsenal supporters in that environment, and are they going to intervene? And what he finds is that people who are the same kin, the same member of the same football team, are more likely to try to intervene and help than if they're from a rival team. But the most interesting part of the finding is this. When they have a discussion first about football in general and find they're all football fans, then they're as equally likely to help anybody, even from a rival team. What it shows, and it goes back to this question, if we make our society more inclusive, we are more likely to have others intervene to help us.
It's almost the sort of shifting parameters of tribal identity then, and they can be artificially accelerated.
Absolutely.
Ken Livingstone, it's the word multiculturalism prompts me to turn to you for reasons I think everyone will understand.
And I mean, it's a question of inclusion. We spoke earlier about people crossing the road when they saw hoodies, but the most scared people are the kids wearing the hoods, because they're the ones that failed at school, they have no prospects. The only thing that gives them a sense of identity is the other kids that have failed. And this is the key. There's been huge progress in reducing crime, however distorted the figures all are. I mean, we know the one crime that does get reported is murder. In this city, it peaked a decade ago at about 225. It's now down to about 145 a year. But I mean, the real problem is, however many extra police, if kids have no prospect of success. I mean, when I was at school, there were I didn't know anyone as unemployed until I was in my late 20s. Those of us that failed at school got a job. You didn't like a job, you went and got another one. 3 evening papers filled with jobs. Those kids aren't certain they've got any future. And therefore, I think they're more prone to that violence. And you've got to reach them earlier, and you've got to have less failures in our education system.
Let me steer you briefly back to the central point of the question, which was about the multiplicity of ethnicities, the multiplicity of social groups, and the likelihood, or rather the diminished likelihood of us intervening to help someone who we identify as being other, as being different from us.
There's an element of that. You're more prone to look after the person that's like you. But the interesting thing about gangs in this city is they're not based on an ethnicity. They're multicultural gangs. They're all the broken kids in an area, irrespective of whether they're black or white or Asian or Muslim or Christian. They're all in there together because they've got nothing.
So the poverty is the unifying.
I mean, it's not just poor. I mean, a lot of people who are poor who do very well and they've got a good home background. It's that the kids that have no prospect, they're the ones that carry a knife. When I was at school, I was in a school in Brixton, 2,000 kids. I think I saw a kid with a knife once in the 6 years I was in that school.
Wait a minute, my mum is now 93. She's just had to go into home, and we were just clearing out her house, and I came across a sheath knife. I mean, it must have had a blade 9 inches long, and I thought, hey, my God, that's the knife I used to take to school.
You what? You're joking.
Well, we've got our scoop, folks. Of course, it's not remarkable, Nick, that you carried a knife to school back in the 19...
I had a pistol as well.
No.
I mean, it was a cowboy pistol, and it sort of actually would now be illegal because it looked fairly realistic. And a lot of my friends carried knives, but we didn't carry knives to defend ourselves. They were for whittling sticks and so forth. The point I'm making is that times have changed. Some things, incidentally, have not changed, and I think society has got much better on the whole. I'm a half-glass full rather than a half-glass empty merchant. I was mugged several times when I was a kid, but it never got into the papers. I didn't even tell my mum. I would go down to the fish and chip shop. I'd be surrounded sometimes by a gang of kids on bikes. I remember once, very humiliating, they were all smaller and younger than I was, but there were just 8 of them. And they'd take your fish and chip money. Now, nowadays, if I'd had a mobile phone or something like that, that would get into the recorded crime stats. It didn't at the time. So I think in many ways, the fact that we're taking these things much more seriously, we shouldn't get depressed that so many things seem to be getting worse. On the whole, I think, generally, they're getting better.
Yeah, and yet the perception remains. Of course, Matthew Taylor, we're staring down the barrel now of quite severe public sector cuts in precisely the areas that would be historically expected to guard us against incidences of antisocial behaviour. Is it possible that the glass is as full as it's ever going to be, and that in 10 years' time we'll look back on this period of history as almost the halcyon days of community cohesion?
Yeah, I think there's a really powerful point there, because we have a tendency, the great British public, always to think that things are worse than they were in the past, and we've heard very convincingly from experts that that isn't the case. Things are better, but we are facing a period where we're going to have more young people who feel a sense of hopelessness, as Ken has described, because we're going to have high levels of youth unemployment for quite a long time to come, and we're going to have public service cuts. And the reality in many local authorities is the things that are cut are things to do with public spaces. It's parks, it's wardens, it's those kinds of people, because they're not statutory services. And those of us who can remember the 1980s, that's what happened to those public spaces. That's when the people were taken off the station platforms, they were taken from the parks, and that's actually the point at which crime peaked and where our kind of deep sense of fear and pessimism came from that period. I think it's taken us a long time. I think this debate, I think the positivity in this room is something that, would have been inconceivable 5 or 10 years ago. So we have got something good. We have got a kind of sense that something can be done, that our communities can be safer and stronger. But as I said earlier, we are now going to have to step forward a bit more if we're not going to look back, not going to be sitting here in 10 or 15 years saying, if only we could go back to 2010, things look so good then.
Well, it's a fairly arresting thought, in fact, because I guess if you were to take your lead from most of the popular newspapers, you'd think it was impossible to conceive of times being any tougher than they are at the moment. The young lady with the sunglasses.
Hi, I work for an arts educational charity called Safeground, and for the past 10 years we've been working with male offenders and their families, looking at ways they can parent responsibly from in prison and trying to engage prisoners in understanding that they can be a responsible citizen while they're in prison and when they get out. And we know that 65% of prisoners' sons go on to become prisoners themselves, which is obviously quite a startling statistic. But I wondered in the training that particularly Ben and Nick were talking about, who do you see as being part of the training? Who do you think should facilitate that? And could you tap into prisons, and could you tap into these young people that maybe have parents in prison and engage them to help deliver the training? Because we're all quite similar. I think Matthew said it earlier. Without making too many assumptions, we're probably quite like-minded people in this room and on the panel. And how can we try and engage those that have had the experience that we might not have had?
It's arguably the most crucial question of all, Ben Rogers. It's your report, so it's only fair to give you first crack.
Well, currently, Diffuse, which is the organisation we've mentioned already that provides this training, uses police officers and actually, in some cases, hostage negotiators. But they are looking to see whether they can not only equip people with these skills, but actually equip people to do this teaching. And I certainly think it would be great if we could widen the net in that way. And I think actually there are many people from all walks of life who would have those skills to be able to teach these skills. The other interesting thing, by the way, is that when people have done this training, and particularly when they learn how to sort of to mediate, they come out and say, I'm going to really use these skills on the street, but I'm also going to go home and I'm going to use them at home. Actually, yeah, I can. I don't always have to escalate every argument that I get into. I can de-escalate it, and I'm going to use them at work, and I'm going to use them at home, and I'm going to use them with my kids.
Nick Ross, for people who aren't familiar with Diffuse or the work that they do, how feasible is it? Convince a skeptic that you can actually teach these skills, possibly even to a slightly reluctant student.
Well, these skills are very widely used, and when you see the programme and you see why police officers have to be taught it, they don't always, incidentally, abide by their training, I'm sorry to say, but you can understand there are many things that we do with body language, rather unconsciously, that sometimes make things worse. Marilyn was talking about earlier, when most of us, without any training, get involved in something, our heartbeat goes up, we start becoming quite aggressive, even though we don't intend to. And the training about how not to look aggressive, how to, as it literally, defuse things, it isn't intuitive, it does help to be taught.
The lady in the front row in the green jacket.
Susie Walton. I work in and around government. I had my 5th child 2 weeks ago, so I do pass out at short notice.
Congratulations.
Try to keep going. I'd like to pick up on the observation, Nick's spoken a lot about social psychology. There's an awful lot of social psychology. There's a phenomenon called copycat behaviour, where we don't like taking a stand and we don't like being an individual. If you have a burning building, you will find people will all exit, they'll follow their leader. Nobody takes a stand. If you have an aircraft evacuation and somebody actually pulls down their duty-free before they go down the evacuation slide, everybody tries to do the same. The point I'm making is we follow our leader, so we need those ambassadors for intervention. If one person takes the lead, you'll find that others will follow. Now, how we inculcate that, I don't know, but we do need these ambassadors. The more that people do take the lead and intervene, people will follow.
I think that we in the media need to take a role in this, because the experiments you talk of, the sort of Solomon Ash, Philip Zimbardo, and all these people, it wasn't people in authority necessarily, it was what people around them were doing. And I think if we in the media give this impression that this is a lawless country, it's all anarchic, it's overrun with hoodies who are likely to knife us at every opportunity, then we're all going to retreat. The interesting thing about Germany, which is we started with this parallel where Germans were twice as likely as Brits to intervene if they saw kids vandalizing a bus stop. The homicide rate in Germany is pretty equivalent to that in the United Kingdom. The actual likelihood of being attacked in Germany is no greater or less than here. So something else is going on, and I think you're absolutely right. The lead we're getting is a rather false one, that nobody else around us will intervene. Why should we?
It's a tabloid culture. It's a very simple question that journalists ask themselves depending on where they work, which is, how can I get the maximum reaction from this story, which is what leads us down the path that you both describe, as opposed to asking, how can I get close to the truth, which might be loosely described as your broadsheet approach to issues of social policy. Matthew?
One of the things I think is potentially that has a lot of potential here is social media, community websites, social networks. Because, as Ken said, the press is never going to report good news in the way they report bad news, simply because actually, unfortunately, we respond better, we are more likely to buy bad news headlines than good news ones. But good community websites can become places where people spread these kinds of stories. If you go into communities, what you'll find if you spend enough time in them is that there are kind of folk stories that go around, and they often tend to be kind of negative.
Yes.
And you need to get to the heart of what those stories are. But also initiatives like Pledge Bank, which is a website where you go on and you say, well, I'll go and spend an hour in the park tidying it up on Saturday if 50 other people do, and then once 50 people have done it, you all go and meet and you make a difference. So I think new forms of media, online media, make it easier for us to organise in ways which were harder in the past.
Although, of course, the most fresh story in most of our minds with regard to social networking sites interacting with crime will be the astonishing response to the crimes committed by Raoul Moat in the northeast just in the last couple of weeks. That, I'm afraid, is the end this evening. My thanks to Ben Rogers, to Nick Ross, Ken Livingstone, Matthew Taylor and Marilyn Hebron. My thanks, of course, also to you. I sense we could comfortably carry on for at least 2 hours more, but it will be taking us well past our bedtimes. Many thanks for your time here at the Royal Society of the Arts. Handing back now to Petri in the studio.